Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how much we love getting a little freaky, right? So today we're diving into Think Like a Freak by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner.
Oh, yeah, I love this book.
Yeah.
It's all about challenging the way we think about problems.
It really is. They really encourage us to get comfortable with the unknown and approach things with a fresh perspective. It's kind of like looking at the world through a funhouse mirror.
Yeah, exactly. One of the first things they talk about is this fascinating example of soccer penalty kicks.
Yeah, the whole idea that statistically aiming straight at the goalkeeper gives you a better chance of scoring than aiming for the corners.
It's totally counterintuitive, right?
It is. Why do you think that is?
I think it has to do with how we perceive risk and reward. Like, aiming for the corners, it just feels more impressive, right?
It does. It's like the Hollywood version of goal.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But because it's so expected, goalkeepers are trained to anticipate it.
So by going straight down the middle, you're actually exploiting their expectations.
Right. It's like they say the best solution isn't always the most obvious one.
It's kind of like that whole idea of injecting something that causes illness to prevent it.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
It's all about looking beyond what seems logical at first glance and considering those unconventional options.
And you know what? It makes me think about our tendency to just follow the herd, even when it might not be the best choice.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
like we're wired to conform.
Hmm.
We gravitate towards what's familiar, even if there's a better path out there.
Which brings us to another big idea from the book, the power of saying, I don't know.
Ah, yes. The freedom of admitting uncertainty.
Levitt and Dubner, they share those funny stories about kids making up answers instead of admitting they don't know something.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there, right? It's like this deep-seated aversion to appearing clueless.
Totally. But the book makes this compelling case for why that's actually holding us back.
It is. It's like by clinging to what we think we know, even if it's wrong, we're actually hindering our ability to learn and grow.
It's like we're putting on these blinders.
Right. And it's not just kids. They even talk about how experts, despite all their knowledge, are often terrible at predicting the future.
Oh, yeah. Like, think about political pundits.
Exactly. They make these pronouncements with such confidence, but studies have shown they're wrong more often than not.
There's that almost unbelievable story in the book about a Nobel-winning economist who compared the impact of the internet to a fax machine.
Can you imagine?
Right.
Like, here's this brilliant mind completely missing the mark.
It just shows you that even the smartest people can get things wrong.
And I think that's a really important message, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
It's so easy to just accept things at face value.
Right. And that can be dangerous.
Like they used the example of the lead up to the Iraq War faulty intelligence that was used to justify a military invasion.
It really highlights the importance of critical thinking, of questioning assumptions, and not just blindly accepting what we're told.
So how do we get better at this whole, I don't know, thing?
Yeah.
Any practical tips?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that knowledge is a journey, not a destination.
We're all works in progress, right?
Absolutely. Embrace curiosity. Ask questions.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to admit when you're out of your depth.
It's like that saying, the only stupid question is the one you don't ask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes it feels like digging deeper. Finding the root of a problem instead of just addressing the symptoms is important too. That's something else Think Like a Freak really dives into.
It does. They use that really thought-provoking example, the link between legalized abortion and the decline in crime rates.
It's a sensitive topic for sure.
It is, but their argument is based on data and logic.
Right. They're not making the moral judgment.
No, their point is that unwanted children are statistically more likely to grow up in circumstances that can lead to criminal behavior.
So as the first generation born after Roe v. Wade came of age, there were fewer of these unwanted children.
And crime rates dropped.
It's a really powerful example of how a single event can have these ripple effects that might not be immediately obvious.
What do you think the main takeaway is here for our listeners?
I think it encourages us to look beyond the surface, to consider the long-term impact of policies and decisions.
And to think about the root causes of problems.
Exactly.
So how does this whole root cause thing apply to other areas of life?
Well, the book actually offers several interesting examples. For instance, they explore the impact of Martin Luther's ideas on the German economy.
Wait, hold on. You're saying there's a connection between religious history and economic performance.
Well, studies have shown that in Germany, regions that are predominantly Protestant tend to have higher average incomes than those that are predominantly Catholic.
Interesting. And is this because Protestants are somehow favored in hiring practices?
No, it's not about discrimination. It seems to be tied to this difference in work ethic.
Like the whole Protestant work ethic idea.
Exactly. Protestants, they statistically work more hours. They're more likely to start their own businesses and have higher female labor force participation.
So it's like a real-life example of Max Weber's theory.
It definitely provides some compelling evidence. And it's a fascinating example of how cultural and historical factors can have this lasting impact on economic development.
And they don't stop there, do they?
Not even close. The book also discusses the link between salt sensitivity and the survival rates of slaves during the Middle Passage.
Okay, now this I have to hear.
So the theory is that slaves who were more sensitive to salt were less likely to die from dehydration during that horrific journey across the Atlantic.
Wow. And this is connected to the higher rates of hypertension we see among African Americans today.
That's the theory. It really makes you think about how events from the past can continue to affect health and well-being today.
It's pretty heavy stuff. It's fascinating how a seemingly simple question in this case about salt sensitivity can lead to such profound insights.
It is. And speaking of simple questions, the book also tells the story of Barry Marshall, the doctor who discovered the link between bacteria and ulcers.
Didn't he actually give himself an ulcer to prove his point?
He did. Back then, everyone thought ulcers were caused by stress. But Marshall, he suspected a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori was the real culprit.
Talk about dedication to your research.
Right. To prove his theory, he actually drank a broth containing the bacteria.
He gave himself an ulcer?
Yep. And then he cured it with antibiotics.
It's amazing how a simple question like, what are these bacteria doing in the stomach, can lead to a major medical breakthrough.
It's a great example of how challenging assumptions and pursuing those seemingly insignificant details can lead to these groundbreaking discoveries.
And this idea of paying attention to the small stuff, it ties into another big theme from the book, the power of thinking small.
Exactly. Levitt and Dubner, they encourage us to embrace smaller problems and focus on finding very specific, actionable solutions.
It's like they're saying, don't try to boil the ocean.
Right. Because those big problems, they're often just too complex and overwhelming.
So break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Exactly. Yeah. And, they give some great examples to illustrate this. Like they talk about a study in rural China where they provided eyeglasses to school children.
And a lot of these kids had vision problems that were affecting their ability to learn.
Right. And by providing them with these affordable glasses, they saw a significant improvement in their academic performance.
So a relatively small intervention had a huge impact on these children's lives.
Exactly. And, it's interesting to connect this back to Barry Marshall's research.
His focus on this tiny detail, the bacteria in the stomach.
It ended up completely changing the way we understand and treat ulcers.
It's a good reminder that even small improvements can make a big difference in our goals.
Absolutely. Whether we're trying to be more productive, learn a new skill, or just make healthier choices.
Thinking small can be really powerful.
And that leads us to another concept. The book explores this whole idea of incentives.
Oh, yeah. I remember this part being really fascinating. They take us on this wild ride through the world of incentives, starting with competitive eating.
Oh, yeah. Takeru Kobayashi.
The hot dog eating champion.
He revolutionized the sport.
His approach was incredible. He broke down the entire process, experimented with different techniques.
It's like a choreographed dance.
He changed the game. It's a great example of how the right incentives can drive innovation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the book also warns about the potential downsides of incentives, right?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes they can have these unintended consequences.
Like they share that pretty disturbing example of a traffic accident in China,
where the driver actually ran over the victim twice.
It's a horrifying example of how badly designed incentives can lead to truly tragic outcomes.
It really makes you think. So what are some of the different types of incentives? I'm curious to hear more about that.
Well, the book covers quite a few, but they start by discussing financial incentives.
Like those cash for grades programs that some schools have tried?
Exactly. And, the results have been mixed.
So money alone isn't a guarantee of academic success.
It seems that way. What do you think that says about the power of financial incentives in education?
Well, it makes me think about intrinsic motivation. Like the desire to learn for the sake of learning, not just for a reward.
I agree. And, then there are moral incentives.
Which often don't seem as powerful as we think they should be.
Right. They talk about that study where people were stealing petrified wood from a national park.
Yeah, and signs asking people to do the right thing barely made a dent.
But when they put up signs saying that most visitors join their neighbors in not taking wood theft, reads plummeted.
It's crazy how appealing to people's desire to fit in can be more effective than appealing to their conscience.
It really highlights the power of social norms,
Mm.
even when they contradict our stated values.
It makes you wonder how much we're influenced by those around us, even when we think we're acting independently.
It does. And this all makes me think about how challenging it can be to actually persuade people, especially when their views are really entrenched.
Oh, yeah. That's a problem we all face in different areas of life.
It is. And it's something that Levitt and Dubner acknowledge. They talk about how difficult persuasion can be, especially when people's views are rooted in their values and beliefs.
They introduce the concept of cultural cognition, right?
They do. It basically means that our understanding of facts is often filtered through this lens of our cultural identity.
Like the groups we belong to.
Exactly. And they bring up the example of climate change.
They found that people with higher scientific literacy are often more likely to hold extreme views on the issue.
Either for or against it.
So knowing more about the science doesn't actually lead to greater agreement.
It seems not. It's like people who are more scientifically literate are just better at finding evidence to back up their existing beliefs.
Regardless of whether those beliefs are actually accurate.
Right, so how on earth do you persuade people in those situations?
It's a tough one for sure.
It is. But the book offers some interesting insights. They suggest that acknowledging the limits of your own argument can be helpful.
Like when they talk about self-driving cars.
Exactly. They acknowledge the potential benefits, like increased safety.
But they also acknowledge the downsides, like job displacement for professional drivers.
Right. When you acknowledge the complexities of an issue, you come across as more credible and trustworthy.
It's about having a nuanced perspective, not just pushing a one-sided agenda.
Another strategy they highlight is avoiding insults and name-calling.
Which seems obvious, but you see it all the time, especially online.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And research actually shows that negative information, it has a stronger impact on our brains than positive information.
So even if you're right about something, calling your opponent names is just going to backfire.
It will. It just shuts down the conversation and makes it impossible to reach any kind of understanding.
So if we want to have productive conversations, what's the alternative?
Well, the book suggests that stories can actually be very powerful.
Stories. Now, that's something I can get behind. But how can a good story be persuasive?
Well, stories are more engaging than just abstract concepts or dry facts,
They make us feel something.
right? They help us connect with ideas in a much deeper way.
It's like the difference between reading a textbook and reading a novel.
That's a great analogy. And the book offers some really cool examples of how stories can be used to change people's minds. Like the U.S. Department of Defense, they use this book called The Encyclopedia of Ethical Failure to teach their employees about ethics.
The Encyclopedia of Ethical Failure. What's in it?
It's basically a collection of true stories about ethical blunders made by government employees.
And it's more effective than just giving them a list of rules.
It seems so. And they also talk about the enduring power of biblical stories.
Like the story of Cain and Abel or the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Exactly. These stories, they've been passed down for centuries because they tap into something universal about the human experience.
And you know what? Studies have shown that people are more likely to remember those stories than, say, the Ten Commandments.
It's amazing, isn't it? It shows how powerful stories can be. They bypass our rational defenses and speak directly to our hearts.
It's not about manipulation. It's about connecting on a human level and helping people see things from a new perspective. And speaking of new perspectives, the book also talks about the importance of quitting.
Wait, quitting? Isn't that kind of going against everything we've been talking about, like grit and perseverance?
We're supposed to never give up, right?
Right. But Levitt and Dubner, they make a really strong case for why quitting can sometimes be the most strategic and even courageous choice.
They even call out Winston Churchill's famous never give up speech.
They do. They point out that while that message might have been inspiring in the context of war, it doesn't always apply to everyday life.
So how do you know when it's actually okay to quit? That's a tough question.
It is. And that's where this concept of the sunk cost fallacy comes in.
Our tendency to stick with something just because we've already invested so much in it.
Exactly, like that home renovation project that's spiraling out of control.
Just feel like you're in too deep to back out.
Right. But the book argues that we need to be more willing to walk away from things that aren't working, even if it means admitting we made a mistake.
It's about recognizing when it's time to cut your losses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes this means being open to feedback from other people, even when it's hard to hear.
It's about being honest with ourselves and knowing when to change course.
And remember that experiment where they had people flip a coin to make decisions?
Yeah, and it turned out people were surprisingly willing to go with the coin's advice. even for big life choices.
It's like sometimes we just need that little push to do what we know deep down is right.
So you're saying sometimes we should just leave it up to fate?
Not for everything, of course,
Yeah.
but it does make you think about the power of relinquishing control and embracing the unknown.
Think like a freak. It's not just a collection of interesting stories, it's a real call to action.
It's a challenge to question everything, to get comfortable with uncertainty, and to be creative in our approach to problems.
It's a reminder that the world is full of hidden patterns and unexpected connections.
And that if we're paying attention, we can unlock those possibilities and achieve incredible things.
This has been a real mind-bending journey so far. So much to think about.
And we're not done yet. There's more to come in part 2 of our deep dive into Think Like a Freak. Stay tuned.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back. You know, one of the things that really stood out to me in Think Like a Freak was how they connect these seemingly unrelated concepts. Like they have this story about David Lee Roth and King Solomon.
The rock star and the wise king. What's the connection?
Well, they both used game theory to achieve their goals.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So King Solomon famously used this clever strategy to figure out who the real mother of a baby was, suggesting they cut the baby in half.
Right. A pretty drastic solution.
It was, but it worked. And then you have David Lee Roth, who, believe it or not, used game theory to make sure Van Halen's concert venues were up to snuff.
Wait a minute. A rock star used game theory. How is that even possible?
It's a great story. So Van Halen, they were known for having these incredibly detailed contracts, right? And buried deep within all the technical specifications, there was this clause about a bowl of M&Ms backstage, with all the brown ones removed.
Okay, hold on. You're telling me this rock star had a meltdown if there were brown M&Ms backstage?
No, it wasn't a tantrum. It was actually a brilliant test.
A test?
Yeah. If Roth found even one brown M&M, it meant that the venue hadn't carefully read the contract.
I see.
And that was a red flag. It could indicate other oversights, safety issues or logistical problems that could derail the whole show.
So it was like a canary in a coal mine.
Exactly. It's thinking like a freak.
Huh.
Coming up with this unconventional solution to a problem that most people wouldn't even think about.
That's so clever. It's like what seemed like a ridiculous demand was actually a strategic move.
Absolutely. And speaking of problems, the book also talks about this interesting challenge. How to get people to sort themselves into different categories.
Self-sorting. What do you mean by that?
It might sound abstract, but it has these really interesting real-world applications. Like they give this example from World War II, this bullet factory in Israel that was disguised as a laundry facility.
A secret bullet factory.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
And they came up with this really ingenious way to avoid being caught. You see, the British soldiers who were stationed nearby, they loved to drink cold beer.
Who doesn't?
Right? So the people running the factory, they offered to chill the soldiers' beer for them if they called ahead.
So they always knew if the British were coming for an inspection.
Brilliant, right? Turning the British soldiers' thirst for cold beer into a way to protect their secret operation.
It's like something out of a spy movie.
Okay, but how does this whole self-sorting idea apply to something like, say, the hiring process?
Well, the book actually suggests that companies might benefit from making job applications more difficult.
Really? That seems counterintuitive. Isn't the trend towards streamlining and making things easier?
It is. But the logic here is that a longer, more demanding application process will deter those casual applicants. So you weed out the people who aren't really serious.
Exactly. It encourages self-selection. Only the truly motivated applicants will make it through.
It's like a test of endurance.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And, Zappos, the online shoe company, they actually do something similar.
What do they do?
They have this policy called the offer. During their training program, they offer new employees a bonus to quit.
They pay people to quit.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, right? But it's a way to ensure that the people who stay at Zappos, they're truly bought into the company culture, which is all about customer service.
So it's another way to encourage self-sorting.
It is. And of course, the ultimate act of self-sorting is quitting a job or a project altogether.
Which we talked about earlier, the whole sunk cost fallacy and the importance of knowing when to walk away.
Right. But how do we actually make that decision in real life?
Yeah.
It's often easier said than done.
It is. It's like our emotions get in the way, fear of failure, social pressure, all those things.
They can really cloud our judgment and make it hard to know when to call it quits.
Do you think that's why they had people flip a coin in that experiment?
Maybe. It's like sometimes we just need that little nudge from fate to help us make the tough call.
So you're saying sometimes we should just leave it up to chance?
Not for everything.
Yeah.
But it does make you think about the power of relinquishing control and being open to the unexpected.
Think like a freak. It's not just a book of interesting stories. It's a real call to action.
I agree. It's a challenge to question everything, to be comfortable with uncertainty, and to get creative in our problem solving.
It's a reminder that the world is full of these hidden patterns and unexpected connections.
And if we're paying attention, we can unlock those possibilities and achieve amazing things.
This has been a really great conversation. It's incredible how many different ideas this book covers.
And we're not done yet.
That's right. We have one more part to go. Let's take a quick break and then we'll come back for the final part of our deep dive into Think Like a Freak. Okay, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Think Like a Freak. One of the things that really stuck with me was their whole discussion about incentives.
Oh, yeah. How to design ones that actually work.
It's tricky, right? Because what seems like it should work in theory doesn't always play out that way in real life.
Human behavior is definitely not always logical.
So what are some of the key takeaways when it comes to designing effective incentives? What do you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think the big thing is understanding your target audience. Like, what motivates them? It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Like they use that study about energy conservation as an example.
Right. Just telling people about the environmental benefits or how they could save money.
Yeah.
It wasn't as effective as appealing to social norms.
It was all about fitting in with the neighbors.
Exactly. People were more likely to conserve energy if they thought everyone else was doing it.
It's like peer pressure for good.
And then, of course, you always have to watch out for those unintended consequences, like the cobra effect.
Oh, yeah, the classic example.
The British government in India, they were trying to reduce the cobra population, so they offered a bounty for every dead cobra.
Makes sense on the surface.
But then people started breeding cobras just to collect a reward.
So the solution actually made the problem worse.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that even when we have good intentions, we need to really think things through.
And consider how people might react in unexpected ways.
Human nature can be unpredictable.
The book also talks a lot about financial incentives.
And they really challenge that assumption that more money always equals better results.
Like those cash for grades programs.
Yeah, the research is pretty mixed on those.
It seems like intrinsic motivation is just as important as any external reward.
Like that story they tell about the economist in Las Vegas.
Offering a woman $1 million to sleep with him.
And she said no.
It just goes to show that money isn't always the answer.
Yes, there's some things you just can't buy.
What about things like moral incentives? How effective are those?
Well, the book suggests they're often weaker than we think.
Like the petrified wood example.
Right. Even when people knew it was wrong to steal the wood, they still did it.
But when they were told that most other visitors didn't steal the wood, suddenly everyone became a saint.
Social pressure can be a powerful force.
It really makes you think about how much our behavior is influenced by those around us.
It does. And, the book also has some interesting things to say about job hunting.
Like what?
Well, they actually encourage people to be more selective.
To focus on finding a job that's a good fit for their interests and skills, instead of just trying to get any job they can.
Exactly. They say it's better to think long-term.
Yeah.
Be willing to start at the bottom and work your way up.
And of course, they reiterate their earlier point about the importance of quitting.
Right. Don't be afraid to walk away from a job that's making you miserable.
Sometimes quitting is the best thing you can do for yourself.
It takes courage, but it can be really empowering.
So what's the big takeaway here? What do we want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I think like a freak. It's really a challenge to question everything.
To think differently, to approach problems with a fresh perspective.
And to not be afraid to experiment and try new things, even if they seem a little unconventional.
It's about embracing our inner freak.
Exactly, and using that freakishness to make the world a more interesting and innovative place.
This has been such a fun and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Think Like a Freak.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep thinking like a freak.